handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to Marc, Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Marc, smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGBT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We get to cover a topic now that I don't know that we've necessarily covered here on the Denise Simon Experience before, and that's climate change. So I'm very pleased to be joined with Marc Morano, who has got a big, huge announcement to make. The title being Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. And his announcement is that his book is just hitting the bookshelves. So, Mr. Marc, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you so much, Denise. I appreciate it. Yes, thank you for the opportunity. My book hits the streets today at the Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change.
I did a little poking around on you. You've been at this for a while. So as a consequence, I got to give you a hat tip for your expertise and your knowledge and your research on climate change and the facts that I don't, you can't even call it a hoax anymore, can you? Because when you start throwing billions of dollars at a problem, it all of a sudden becomes something much worse than a hoax. It becomes, it's something beyond a scandal, isn't it, Marc?
Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps, as the former Czech president, Václav Klaus, has said, the global warming agenda is perhaps the greatest threat to human liberty and freedom since the fall of the Eastern Bloc countries and the fall of the Soviet Union. And there's a reason he said that. And I interviewed, just at the most recent UN conference in Germany, the Cristina Figueres, the former United Nations climate chief. She has called for a centralized transformation that will make life on planet Earth very different for everyone in order to fight global warming, led by the central planners and bureaucrats at the United Nations. That is what this is about. Calls for global governance, calls for wealth redistribution, calls for essentially turning our lives over to nameless UN bureaucrats and allowing their agenda to dominate the planet and affect every aspect of our lives, from our light bulbs to our dishwashers to washing machines to our cars to our home heating to agriculture to transportation to airline flights to whole economies, planned recessions in order to fight global warming. It's all in the book, detailed. And it's, I tried to make this as wacky and entertaining as possible, but beneath that, this is a very serious issue.
It is. Well, we knew from the Obama administration, I mean, he made some very compelling speeches to the point where we're all ready to go, dig into some bunker and live there for the rest of our lives. So, the rivers can flow freely and water can reappear in Africa, and the polar bears will be happy for the rest of their lives. But Marc, poking around, the General Accounting Office for the United States reported that up until the year 2014, I couldn't find anything after that, although I suspect the numbers are out there. The United States, the federal government, has spent $26.1 billion on climate change initiatives, research, technology, adaptation, and international assistance. I can't imagine what we've spent in the last 4 years, but I would think it would be approaching something in the neighborhood of 60 or 70 billion. this is a problem. I mean, these are billions that could go elsewhere. And what changes have been made in the last 15 years that have slowed anything down, Mark?
Well, okay, I have a whole chapter on funding. I have a whole chapter in the book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, on funding this whole international beast that includes academia, the media, United Nations, foundations, the school system. Its tentacles have just gripped everywhere. And essentially, this is the most well-funded environmental scare of all time, and it's one of the most well-funded political movements of all time. And what's most shocking is, despite all those numbers you just mentioned, if we commit, and the other countries already have committed to this UN Paris Climate Agreement, we would be committing to the most expensive treaty in world history, and it's estimated to cost $100 trillion over its lifetime, and to do absolutely nothing for the climate, but do a lot for redistribution of wealth, global governance, their phrase, United Nations officials, and Al Gore's own phrase, global governance, and it would be a huge move to central planning, repress growth in the developing world. One of the insidious things the United Nations has done with all this money that you've mentioned, they have a climate fund. I like to call it the climate slush fund. But in the book, I detail South African development activists explains where this money goes. It goes to corrupt third world dictators who are most willing and able to keep their countries poor, locked in poverty, and their citizens in dire back-breaking subsistence existence. In other words, you'll get nice, lavish funds from the United Nations, and you get to use it to ensure your re-election, to pay off your cronies, to have 7 vacation homes if you're a dictator in Africa. At the same time, all you have to do is pledge to lock up your natural resources, not allow economic development, which is probably what you were going to do anyway as a corrupt leader, but you're just getting big checks for it, and then you can go along and support the UN. And then the UN can come out and say, how could all these countries be for it? If it was going to harm their development, they're all supporting us here. Well, they're paying key countries to support it, and then beyond the poor countries, they have advocates now who show up at these UN conferences, they're major global warming activists like Kevin Anderson, who advocate for planned recessions in the first world, the United States, Europe, and other places, to fight global warming. In other words, they love recessions and economic downturns because our emissions go down, and that's good for the Earth. So the money is everywhere. In the book, I detail how much the environmentalists have, how much the government has, and most shockingly, the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry has ended up now being a huge contributor to the movement, so they can appear green. And that's the funny thing. And they've given more, the natural gas industry has given more to the Sierra Club than the entire combined budgets of all the skeptical organizations in Washington. I go through all the numbers. So the idea that this is a David fighting Goliath, it is, but it's actually the Davids are the global warming skeptics. The Goliath is the government industrial complex of the climate movement.
Woo! I would say that when you get into the oil and gas sector, that they are making those contributions kind of just as a means to do business. In order to get a permit to do A, they have to pay B, and so it's just a cost of doing business.
It's greasing the skids, and it's not just the behind-the-scenes skids that we traditionally see business has done. This is the PR side. I mean, this is a lot of it's done for PR, so they can appear green. So you have major industries like Hewlett Packard, others sponsoring groups. When recently, a month ago in the UK, they were sponsoring a group that was calling for setting up a criminal island to exile global warming deniers to and lock them up. I mean, it's really wacky stuff. And in the past, corporations have sponsored the 1010 group in England, which had a video which they said was purported to be funny, where 2 kids in the class wouldn't go along with the global warming agenda, so their heads get blown up. And a graphic scene with blood flying everywhere and splattering. This is the kind of stuff corporate America has been funding, and it goes right in line with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Bill Nye, calling for literally jailing global warming skeptics, or deniers in their words.
You almost don't even know where to go with any of this. We're supposed to have, when we donate in an earmark and spend billions of dollars, you generally have an inspector general assigned to from government that investigates these dollars, and then they do these reports and say, oh gee, we sent this over to Benin or some other Niger or Cote d'Ivoire, and they're doing remarkable things over there with our money, and we're not doing that, are we?
No, not at all. But I will tell you, you mentioned that the second part of the fighting thing. Here's the good news. Trump has been elected. Trump is trying to fight it. His Office of Management and Budget Director has said we're not going to be wasting money on global warming. Yeah, but the problem is the Republican Congress has been notoriously weak on this. When I worked on Capitol Hill, I worked in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee during the height of the cap and trade climate bill craze. I can tell you in closed-door meetings, really conservative members of the staff of conservative members of the Senate were terrified of standing up to global warming. They said, we don't want to look like we're against global warming. We don't want to look like we're against the environment. We have to word this only in economic terms. So they would be intimidated.
Yeah.
So what's happened is Republicans are weak. Trump's probably not going to get anywhere near the cuts he wants. He'll be lucky to get a cut in the rate of increase, let alone not have huge increases in all these budgets. But Trump has been an important reset in that it's given us at least a pause in this whole agenda.
Yeah, some breathing.
And it's been huge because no other Republican president would have done what Donald Trump did. And I mean, no, President Romney wouldn't have done it. President McCain wouldn't have done it. President George W. Bush wouldn't have done it. President Dole wouldn't have done it. President George H.W. Bush wouldn't have done it. No other previous Republican nominee or president, other than maybe Ronald Reagan, would have pulled out of that Paris Agreement once we were in it. In fact, Mitt Romney was urging Trump to stay in. Trump stood up, did the courage of his convictions and his promises to the people who elected him, and he withdrew us from that. The problem now is if Trump doesn't win re-election, I don't know what Mike Pence's position is. The Republicans are very weak on this. This will just be a blip, and they're going to go right back. We'll be right back in the Paris Agreement. So we can't let our guard down. Just because it's very good now, we're overturning the EPA regulations, we're out of that. It doesn't mean we're out of the water yet. It just means that this is a good thing that's happened. The question is, how long will it last?
Mark, I'm all about being a good steward of your environment. I'm all about, not damaging it any more than we necessarily have to. I mean, in a lot of things that we do as individuals, as local governments, and federal governments, there are some reckless things for sure. So I think that there, should be some kind of nosing around in those aspects. But I mean, billions. And I don't even know that we will ever know all of the dollars that we have assigned to this as a government and or corporations. And we're forcing corporations to say, we don't want to keep being the only ones advertising these kinds of things. So you corporations have to pay for these advertisings. You have to have things on your websites about all of this. You have to do videos. You have to pay these fees and fines and blah, 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 blah. And in the meantime, we have things that in other aspects that are costing us, like crop and flood insurance, relief there. We've got land management. We've got repair to roads and federal facilities and federal lands that we have to pay. So not only are we just assigning dollars over here, you got all these other dollars over here that GAO is actually forced to assign that says, well, this is because of climate change. I was part of Hurricane Irma. Well, there wasn't anybody, I don't think, really in the state of Florida. Puerto Rico's another story, but Florida, they're just a well-oiled machine when it comes to dealing with these kinds of things. And nobody as an individual is whining about it, but if they don't get the dollars because they're relying on it, these countries and states are putting it in their budgets, so they don't get those dollars, what happens? They're all going to fall apart and the polar bears are going to be, knocking at the front door?
Well, that's the funny thing. And you'll hear this over and over. You mentioned like insurance policy, because we'll have Secretary of State John Kerry and others say, well, we need an insurance policy in case the skeptics or deniers are wrong on global warming. Well, would you buy an insurance policy on your house that cost more than your home was worth and had no payout if your house burned down? Because that's what the climate insurance policy is when you're talking EPA regulations or UN climate agreements. And you're right. Now all these local municipalities and states, we have attorney generals now seeking to essentially shake down energy companies. The New York Attorney General is trying to say that every time there's a flood or a tornado or a hurricane, that energy companies should be ascribed a percentage of their cause for that. In other words, Hurricane Harvey will say ExxonMobil's 15% responsible, therefore we're seeking this amount. And they're trying to shake down large companies every time there's a bad weather event. Well, besides being a financial shakedown with obvious, transparent motivations, the science is completely against them, because on every metric of extreme weather, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, wildfires, on down, not only is the extreme weather not increasing or it's stable, but it's actually decreasing. And certainly the case with hurricanes, certainly the case floods have been stable. Tornadoes, big tornadoes have dropped dramatically. Droughts, as bad as California's drought was, droughts were much worse in the past and actually have shown a decline. Even United Nations data, hidden, but it shows all of this. So they just don't have that science, but everyone's trying to get climate funds, anything they can get in the name of climate to fight. And the only thing that would make sense in that regard is obviously any state, local, city, municipality wants to be resilient to any potential storm. So you do want good infrastructure, but they don't need to label it global warming or climate change. They can just call it, bad weather insurance or something. But it's literally bastardized every aspect of government, because they think they can just get money now if they label something climate change or a climate change cause, and they're trying to get the money with all these financial shakedowns. Now, Al Gore's involved in this, Eric Schneiderman, the New York Attorney General, the Massachusetts Attorney General. This is their big thing, and they're trying to say that carbon dioxide is akin to tobacco. And that doesn't make sense, because we inhale oxygen as humans, exhale carbon dioxide, and to compare carbon dioxide, a trace essential gas in the atmosphere, to tobacco or nicotine or cigarettes just makes no sense at all at any level.
So when you travel around, Mark, do you feel like sometimes you have a target on your back with all? I mean, because you're outnumbered.
Yes, in the book, the Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, I actually include, and it's actually in the bonus E chapter, all the death threats and the hate mail I've got. Threats against my children, threats against my family, threats against me. I've gotten phone calls, viciousness. It's very much so. And I've been when I was in Paris, 2015, at the UN Climate Summit, releasing my film, The Climate Hustle, at the time, we had a movie premiere in Paris with tons of protesters. The police came. They almost had to shut us down because it was so chaotic. They had wanted posters of me throughout the streets of Paris on the day of the movie premiere. And my mug shot, just like you'd see in the police or FBI state. And it said, wanted for being a climate de criminel, a climate criminal in French. And they were plastered all over the city. I have a picture of that in my book. This is how they operate. One of the people who had a similar poster to that was an Australian energy CEO. He ended up feeling so intimidated, threatened, he left the Paris Agreement because of these posters. So this is their goal. It's intimidation. It's silence. The whole 97% memo, the whole use of the word denier, it's all designed to silence opposition, not allow any legitimate debate on a subject, because they want to steamroll. And that's what this is all about. In fact, they actually laud China. In the book, I detail how New York Times columnist Tom Friedman and others will praise China for its one-party rule and not having the messiness of democracy where they can just get things done because they're a dictatorship.
I spent a month in mainland China several years ago, and I thought I was on the one place on Earth that the sun didn't shine, because it did not come out for 1 month, and you could barely see about 50 feet in front of you due to the smog. And I'm in mainland China, an obscure province. I thought, and if you think China's going to do anything about it, they're taking whatever monies, and they're advancing their Silk Road agenda. Anyway, so Mark, in your book, you make all of these factual conditions and declarations, but yet you're going to go up against the behemoths of people, as you just mentioned. For instance, NOAA, when we have government agencies that are twisting facts, how do we unwind those kinds of things?
Well, we've already started. Congressman Smith of the House Science Committee and others have tried to start investigative hearings, trying to look into it, but it's notoriously hard to get anything pinned down. The best way to do it is expose it and defund it. And Donald Trump has the right idea. He's made all the right proposals. In the book, I quote MIT scientist Dr. Richard Lindzen as saying that we need to cut this funding 80 to 90%. And one of the things NOAA is accused of is altering the past temperatures. And I actually go through a whole series of how they've altered the past. They cool the past to make the present look even warmer and show an enhanced warming rate or warming trend. So NOAA is at the heart of this. NASA's involved. At first, let's talk about the global warming pause, which was a temperature standstill since 1997, 1998. They have first denied it existed. Then I document in the book over 60 excuses for how it happened. Chinese coal use, the global warming ate our homework. Oh, it's because of the sun, it's ocean cycles, it's this, it's that. And then after they denied it and then came up with excuses for it, over 60, then they said, oh, darn it, we're going to get rid of it. They went back in the historical record, made some adjustments, and presto, they said, oh, we made the adjustments, we had something off. Guess what? There was never any global warming pause. So now if you look back at both the satellite and the land-based surface data, the pause has been erased from the past. Now, if you have a company and you're losing money and you're trying to get investors, and you've had this horrible financial record, it'd be like hiring a new accountant to come in, redo your books from 10, 15 years ago, make it look like you had huge profits, and suddenly you're in a very attractive company. That's what they've done with the case for global warming. They've gone back and they've tried to enhance their argument so they can get more converts by altering the past. It's been one of the most outrageous things, and it's detailed in the book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change.
I'm just wondering how come we don't have dust bowls and sagebrush, rolling across streets right now, because there's no more water left. And, we're protecting the oceans, but I don't know what we're protecting them from it, but they're rising. And, we don't have this rainfall over here, but other places are getting this kind of rainfall, and our water reserves are diminishing. And, they'll take virtually any condition and expand it by 20 or 30%, and not include the history on it that these are cycles. Mark, did I get that right?
Yes, absolutely. What they've done is they cherry pick any cycle. What I like to liken it to, in order the way they sell this, if you're in a casino promotions or lottery promotions, all you do is hype. Look at this. This person won here. This person won here. Guess what? Every time you have a lottery, someone wins. It's amazing. Everyone's a winner. So they create this whole impression. What they've done with global warming is they've gone around the globe and they found a heat wave in Australia, a drought in California, a typhoon in the Philippines, a flood in Europe. Yeah, forest fire in Seattle, and whatever it is. And they'll say, oh my gosh, look at this. This is extreme weather. It's coming for you. You're next, and blah, blah. It's the reverse of what they do. So instead of saying everyone's a winner with the lottery or the slot machines, they're saying everyone's going to be a loser. We have to do this. Look at this. It's coming around. But it's the opposite of reality, because you start looking at the trends on every metric. And you mentioned sea level. Sea level has actually decelerated, if anything, or shown no acceleration. So despite all these fears about global warming, it's not happening. And I get into how they have dueling data sets and different adjustments on everything from the temperature data to sea level and a host of other issues in the climate debate, so they can always cherry pick something. And one of the things I get into in the book is how they predict both outcomes. In other words, recently they had two competing studies, one predicting more lightning strikes due to global warming, one predicting less. Guess what? No matter what happens, they predicted it. If you're betting on a Super Bowl and you predict both teams are going to win, you're going to be a winner. You're going to be able to say, I bet on this team. They're doing that on malaria. They did that on heavy snowfall, cold winters. They have predictions that say global warming will cause more snow, global warming will cause less snow. And now it's like no matter what happens, hey, we predicted it. The models were correct. And they get away with it. Till now.
Marc Morano, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. Congratulations, certainly, on the book. Hitting the shelves today. And I would say, I hope you have a robust security team that you've already had to have some kind of a tripwire, security envoy around you. And you may need continued security after where this goes. But I'm just very happy that, you had the guts to do this, and rightly so. What a mess. Just what a mess, and what a scam. And it is the fleecing of tax dollars and things that, we have virtually no control over. So Mark, come back again. Great conversation, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. You can order a copy at Amazon. Please, The Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. Go to Climate Depot. We have a link there as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. More coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you this 24/7 stream of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. We are a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. If you're able, please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. Your donation will go a long way in helping us continue to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Hi, this is Captain Matt Bruce from the Captain's America Third Watch, and you're listening to Talk America Radio, the new dominant force in conservative talk radio.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia.
And Don Newen from Cowboy Logic Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't go to sleep every night completely fatigued from trying to restore America from the destruction that is taking place,
then you're simply not doing enough. Join us every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Cowboy Logic Radio.
let the restoration begin.
Donald Trump came to Washington vowing to drain the swamp and make government work for the American people. But the swamp creatures in D.C. aren't going down without a fight, and the deep state is determined to overturn the election and keep their gravy train rolling. In these turbulent times, it's critical for patriots to stay engaged and be prepared to defend this president. You can stay up to date on Trump's battle to make America great again by listening to America First Radio with Jim Dawes each weeknight at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Liberty Feed.
Hi, it's Mark Walters from Armed American Radio. You know, for nearly a decade, I've been educating, informing, and entertaining responsibly armed Americans. And during that time together, we've shared some ups and downs, haven't we? Trump's election saved our Supreme Court and no doubt the future of our gun rights for now. But now is not the time to lay down. The enemies of freedom are well-funded and more determined than ever. To keep up with the state of your gun rights, make sure to tune in to Armed American Radio right here on Talk America Radio, the new dominant voice in conservative talk radio.
This is Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience. When I'm not debating with Donna Fiducia about politics, I listen to Cowboy Logic Radio. Why, you ask? Because outside of my blog, founderscode.com, and my own radio show, the Denise Simon Experience, Cowboy Logic is by far the most entertaining and informative radio show on planet Earth. Plus, Don makes me feel guilty if I don't listen to his radio show every week.
You cannot retreat to your safe spaces. There are no therapy poodles allowed, especially when facing the truth. And that's just how we like it. Straight, hard, conservatarian talk, on the rocks, no chaser. Served up on the Adrian Slade Show. Small, limited government, constitutional conversations, exclusively on Talk America Radio. Every Saturday morning, 9 a.m. on Talk America Radio Liberty.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We're going to talk about Google. Woohoo! I have Jarrett Stepman with us on the Daily Signal, which is part of the Heritage Foundation, one of my favorite publications out there. And we've been hearing a little bit about some creepy things that Google is doing, YouTube, and Jarrett's on the case. So Jarrett decided that he was going to join us on the Denise Simon Experience. So thanks, Jarrett, for doing this.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on your show again.
You know, I'm annoyed. I'm about as annoyed. I wrote about this whole thing the other day about this trusted flagger program that YouTube has. And, you know, after I saw your piece, and then I guess because of you guys, it ended up in media, some media, I might add, that YouTube decided to partner with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Woohoo!
It is pretty incredible. You know, maybe some people don't know what the Southern Poverty Law Center is. They're an organization that at least claims to be one that goes after hate groups, what they call hate groups, and they claim to be a civil rights kind of organization, but their mission has really morphed over the years so that they don't just go after, you know, things like neo-Nazis or stuff like that. They tend to lump in, especially socially conservative organizations like the Family Research Council and others. So they're an organization that, unfortunately, a large part of the media relies on to flag hate groups. This organization really has basically opened things up to include people who are by no definition hate groups and are certainly hold what I consider mainstream values. So I think that's why this is so worrying that YouTube and Google would partner with such a group that, you know, claims to be going after hate, which I have to say, you know, a lot of people say perpetuates hate and targeting of people who simply have conservative values, not ones that they claim, which are, you know, things like neo-Nazis or skinheads or people like that.
Isn't it interesting that these people over there at the Southern Poverty Law Center have branded them the Supreme Court of hate, and that they are the single expert and go-to organization for deciding these things?
It is very concerning. I think recently Christina Hoff Sommers, who's an AEI scholar who has very mainstream values, who merely questions a lot of ideas about feminism, was recently lumped in one of their recent lists for hate groups. And it is very disturbing to me that media outlets unquestionably cite them. I mean, it's not just YouTube. It's, you know, ABC, CNN. You see across the board organizations citing the SPLC without revealing what the SPLC really is about. It's a hardcore, hard-left organization that's cast a wide net in what it defines as a hate group. It's very, very loosely defined. So, you know, organizations that are very mainstream or generally socially conservative or for family values get lumped in with people like the Ku Klux Klan. And I don't think a lot of people understand this. And the media, I have to say, it's pretty irresponsible for the media to continue to cite them, given that they have cast such a wide net and have really maligned some good people, some fairly mainstream conservative views.
When you travel over to YouTube, they're calling this the Trusted Flagger Program.
Yeah, which is it's very interesting because the Trusted Flagger Program really gives these select list of organizations pretty broad powers to flag essentially content they deem inappropriate. And this actually goes beyond the powers of YouTube itself. They have broad powers to flag on their own what they deem inappropriate. And, you know, we've seen YouTube go after conservative outlets in the past. PragerU several years ago had issues where some of their videos that were very normal videos got suddenly pulled and they were suddenly wiped off the website. And so this Trusted Flaggers program is a very worrying thing. I hate to use the term censorship, but it really is censorship. And an organization like SPLC, I don't think there's any question that they will hesitate to try to shut down mainstream conservative opinion. I don't think there's any question about that.
Well, we know that SPLC is part of the group, the part of the program, but we don't know who else is.
Right.
How did we find out that
they generally tend to keep it pretty tight-lipped to who's in this program. And I contacted YouTube to try to figure out, if this allegation was true. They wouldn't get back to me. They didn't get back to a number of other reporters who were in more conservative media. But it was confirmed by a release that they gave to Think Progress, which is the hard left website. So it was confirmed through that. But they are they do keep it very much private, generally what organizations are part of this trusted flaggers list. And, I think it's just a general part of Silicon Valley. I mean, we've heard so much about, fact-checking and trying to figure out what's fake news. And sometimes I think it's really important that people question who the fact-checkers are, who these people are who say that they are determining what's truth and what's not truth. The Silicon Valley and the high-tech industry is a very left-wing place. There's a lot of groupthink that takes place there. And I think we should be worried. When we go on Facebook, when we use social media platforms, they're trying to cultivate content that may have a certain point of view. And I think it's very important for Americans to be aware of this, to not simply think, well, they're just a neutral platform for all views, that they do now have a skew, certainly a deep skew.
Well, in order to be part of the Trusted Flagger program, whether you're government or non-government, you apply. And then they go, okay, now you get to attend a YouTube training to learn about their guidelines and enforcement processes. And then YouTube/Google appears that they would approve you, and then they give you a title that you're a deputy. You now become deputized for participation. So by virtue of that little word, deputized, that also tells me that they are becoming First Amendment police, right?
That's absolutely correct. I think you said it well before when you say they've been kind of deemed like the Supreme Court of fact checking. Basically they're saying that they trust these groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center with broad powers. I mean, this is not like they just take what SPLC says as a suggestion. They are granting them broad powers to police and, yes, potentially censor content on YouTube. What are they censoring? I mean, we don't know. You don't see as a user who is actually going after the content. So they are working within the tools of YouTube itself to potentially censor who knows what is up actually on there. So yes, I think it's a very worrying thing that they've given them organizations like SPLC and certainly what appears to be many, many others this kind of power, and really unbeknownst to the public. I mean, people wouldn't have known about this if it hadn't been the work of a few reporters who had some kind of inside information. So I think it is very important that this kind of stuff, that it gets out to the public so that we know in these platforms like YouTube what exactly they're all about. They're not always necessarily just a neutral platform for anybody to use.
Well, when you say broad, you're exactly right, because I'm looking at one thing here that says harmful or dangerous content. Don't post videos that encourage others to do things that might cause them to get badly hurt, especially kids. Well, hurt how?
That's absolutely right. When they say this, the question is, what exactly does this mean? I mean, what is hurtful? I mean, the PragerU videos that were basically pulled down a few years ago, there was nothing that you could say would be hurtful about these. And I realize there has been issues with things like terrorists and Islamists who go and use YouTube to peddle their views. But, what happens when they start to include what I call mainstream conservative opinions or other opinions? I mean, how are we deeming those violent or aggressive? I mean, that really is the problem here.
Well, I mean, you can go over to YouTube and you can pretty much type in anything. I mean, you can type in Islamic State and you're going to find some stuff there. Now, is that graphic? Is that violent? Is that hateful? Well, yeah. Yet you can travel on over there and put in nuclear weapons, and all of a sudden you see, things that are imploding. Well, is that violent or graphic? Well, you see what I'm saying? So, I mean, it looks to me as though YouTube and Google officials, people that are on their payroll, employees, are not making these decisions. They have outsourced it to this flagger program with these deputized organizations like SPLC. And so if you, Jarrett, knock on the door of YouTube/Google and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" and they're not responding, it's because there's nobody there to respond. You have to go over to SPLC, right?
That's absolutely right. And not to just target Google and YouTube. They're certainly not the only social media organization that does stuff like this. I mean, we've seen other issues on Twitter. We've seen it on Facebook. I think there was a particularly hilarious incident recently with Facebook actually doing a fact check on what is essentially a satire website called the Babylon Bee that posted this article saying that, well, CNN purchased a washing machine to spin news. It was clearly a satire. But Facebook actually had a Snopes.com fact check of this satire and flagged it this content on their website. I mean, that's the kind of ridiculous stuff that's going on with some of this fact checking. I mean, anybody could see that the original Babylon Bee story was intentionally satire. It was meant to be humorous. And yet the fact checkers at Facebook, because their logarithm, put up a Snopes piece fact-checking this. I mean, we've seen this kind of absurd thing happen with some of this fact-checking. I really have to say it kind of makes you question the kind of role that they've had with the fact-checking content and all these things, you know, the geniuses in Silicon Valley, and this is what they've come up with.
They take it a step further, Jarrett, because they go, everybody hates spam. Don't create misleading descriptions, tags, titles, or thumbnails in order to get increased views, including repetitive content, comments, and private messages. So they're cultivating private messages as well.
Oh, yes, and this is why, you know, I have to say, as somebody who uses social media, I'm very wary of what I post on there, even things that are private. I mean, this is why people don't trust
so you're not self-censoring.
Companies like Google. They don't trust companies like Facebook. I mean, we have reason not to trust them at all. I mean, especially with some of their practices, that people feel like they're being tracked. They feel like their content is being watched. Now, given I don't think they're sitting there watching what Jarrett Stepman is doing all day long, but it does make one worry for sure.
So then what ends up happening is, because of them, you become self-censoring. You have to pause and think about how you're going to word something. You even probably go, no, that doesn't sound right. And you even backspace and redo it 2 or 3 times, because otherwise you're going to end up in YouTube prison or Facebook prison.
Absolutely. Actually, this does remind me. I was recently at the CPAC Conservative Political Action Conference, and there was a panel I was on with ex-Googler James Damore, who got fired from Google for writing what people considered a politically incorrect piece about the practice of Google. And what he said, I think, was very interesting. Is that these high-tech companies, they're mostly staffed for people with a very left-wing point of view. They're very liberal. They're kind of in these bubbles. And it's not as if they're trying to outright necessarily go after conservative opinion all the time, but they kind of want to put those ideas kind of out of bounds. And they want to kind of cultivate the environment that essentially that their products use. So a lot of opinion that is not deemed politically correct kind of gets pushed to the sidelines. People talk about things that worry, things like shadow banning and stuff like that, where your content can't actually be viewed even though you're posting it. So, I think it's every reason to be wary of the practices of the high-tech industry and to be aware of how essentially they can use these tools that seem innocuous. They seem, things like fact-checking. It sounds very innocuous. It sounds like, oh, well, of course we want the straight facts. But why we should look at these with a certain degree of skepticism, because what are the opinions of the people who say they're doing the fact-checking? I mean, that is the ultimate question here. Are they absolutely neutral in all things? Well, it doesn't look like it. Certainly with things like the story about the Southern Poverty Law Center being a trusted flagger. I mean, are these people really neutral, objective observers? I don't think so.
Jarrett, is Google/YouTube subject to FOIA so that we can find out who these other flaggers are?
Well, unfortunately, because they're not a government agency, they're not really subject to FOIA. I mean, it really is up to enterprising journalists to go out and try to figure out the practices of these companies. I mean, that's the important thing here is that, look, I mean, especially, for instance, like when this fact-checking Google program came out a few months ago, a lot of people immediately picked up on the fact that, hey, they're just fact-checking conservative websites, and there are basically no liberal websites on their list. They got hit with a storm of discontent, people saying that they were biased, and they actually had to pull this fact-checking tool. So I have to say, it's really up to people in the media and people being skeptical and essentially going out and saying, hey, their practices are wrong. Something is not right with this picture here, and trying to disseminate that information and pushing back. And look, there's a lot of these companies, their businesses, I mean, a lot of times businesses are afraid about their bottom line when they feel that their customers are not happy with the product and feel that they're certainly biased against them. They'll stop using their product, they'll give them bad press, and to a certain extent, that's the best check on a lot of these companies that have these kind of practices is simply other people going out and saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong, what you're doing is biased. And I think a lot of these companies are, through the power of public opinion, forced to change their practices.
You mentioned Dennis Prager and PragerU, so we have David and Goliath here. Do we know where that case is legally? I have actually read his official complaint against Google, but I don't know where it is in the legal process. Would you by chance?
It is still making its way through the legal process. It has not been finalized, but it is a very serious charge. We at Daily Signal did report on this quite a bit, and there were a number of videos that PragerU had put up that had been censored for no real explainable reason. And so I think this kind of stuff, and certainly there are legal legal ways to go about this. So certainly it's a disturbing trend, and that case hasn't really been finalized yet. But I certainly eagerly await what the decision comes down on that.
That'll be a big one. And it was a week and a half ago, I think 2 weeks ago, that Twitter and Facebook, Google, somebody else, they were actually on the Hill giving some testimony. It might be prudent to go back and watch that testimony again, because they were being challenged with taking down and not quickly enough and or cultivating what Islamic State has done on social media. They didn't react fast enough, or in some cases at all. And the other part of that is the false advertising, if you will, the bots and the trolls by Russia. So it might be prudent to kind of go back and revisit that testimony, because again, they keep up some weird stuff, and then the other stuff, not only do they take it down, but it's kind of like they make sure that it doesn't become trending. You use a hashtag often enough so it would trend, and then they can alter the equation, the math on the hashtag trending, correct?
Oh, that's correct. So there was a big story that came out during the presidential campaign that Facebook was indeed suppressing trending items that favored, at the time, candidate Donald Trump or generally conservative views, which was actually funny because at one point the Facebook censorship was actually trending, and of course that clearly didn't make the people there working there particularly happy, and they had to reassess their logarithm. But I think these kind of allegations that they're at least putting the button on in favor of certain views, I think has been true. I think certainly the executives at these companies are a little worried because as soon as these stories come out that they're not exactly neutral platforms, I think it damages their product because there are a lot of liberals, there are a lot of conservatives who use platforms like Facebook, to organize or to talk with one another, and it really damages the credibility of these things if they think, well, what I have to say is going to potentially be censored or shut down. I think that's definitely a worrying thing, and I think a lot of these big companies are worried about, at the end of the day, their bottom line when they have customers who are not happy with being shut down.
So, and then they have this terms of service, right? That they say you're in violation of terms of service, but they won't tell you what the violation is, correct?
That's exactly correct. And again, that is why things like using the Southern Poverty Law Center, these trusted flaggers, they have the ability to essentially go out and shut people down. And you could be sitting there with, you know, your YouTube channel suddenly shut down, thinking, well, what happened to my content? What's wrong with what I said? You wouldn't even know the organization that shut you down. It wasn't necessarily even YouTube. It was one of these third parties that had these kind of broad policing powers to censor views. So, you know, obviously a very concerning thing.
Is the Southern Poverty Law Center a non-government organization? Because we know under the Eric Holder Justice Department, Justice used and collaborated with the Southern Poverty Law Center often. So can they be considered an NGO?
They are an NGO. They're a nonprofit that has an enormous budget and endowment. I mean, they're basically have a $200 million endowment. They're a massive organization that is incredibly powerful, that has clearly some very big donors. So, you know, to take, you know, the Southern Poverty Law Center is certainly no small-time mom-and-pop operation. They're basically a very, very well-funded, very well-organized organization that, you know, has become such a go-to source in the media, rather unquestionably, in the last few years in particular, and has really veered off and become, I have to say, even more radical in the last few years than they've ever been. I mean, they started off as, you know, billing themselves as a civil rights organization. They kind of stuck to, you know, going after things like the Ku Klux Klan, but now they've broadened their discretion, and now they're lumping in all these what I would consider very mainstream conservative groups, and now they're all lumped in together. And because they have such power, it definitely influences how these media reports on things and what happens to those who are caught up in these nets. I mean, it can be devastating when you're put on their hate list, their hate groups list. A lot of organizations, they won't do business with you. A lot of organizations will be afraid to put ads on your website. They won't donate. There was a scandal kind of last year where this organization called GuideStar, which kind of helps navigate donations, started to, for tax purposes, started to use SPLC to basically flag groups that were hate groups so people wouldn't donate to them. Well, fortunately, after a lot of pushback, GuideStar actually stopped using SPLC, but only after there was a huge outcry, especially from a lot of conservative groups saying, why are you using this, essentially this organization that's targeting us? So, again, I mean, there are ways to push back, but the SPLC is a very powerful organization. A lot of times what it says,
and protected.
Exactly. And so I think there's every reason to be concerned about its growing power in some of our most prominent social media platforms.
Well, I mean, they, you know, push back on harassment and hate speech and spam and all those kinds of things, when I would argue that SPLC does that very thing themselves. So
that is for sure.
It's that is the real definition of the pot calling the kettle black here in this regard. Well, I want to congratulate you on staying on top of this story. You and the other investigative journalists with this trusted flagger program, because the word trusted in there is subject to definition by somebody's standards, and we little people out here, I'm not sure that they really are going to trust Google and YouTube and Facebook as they should. But Jarrett, we certainly appreciate your time and your work on this, and something that we need to keep up on. So I may be tapping you on the shoulder again pretty soon to see where we are on.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for bringing me on your show. It really is my pleasure.
Happy to do it. Good job. And ladies and gentlemen, we got more coming your way. Stay with us.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to Marc, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Marc, smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEVT, gas TOT 53.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I got the distinct pleasure of having Robert Spencer with us, who's been a previous guest several times on the Denise Simon Experience. And what's even more fun is that he's such an expert on so many topics. He's a New York Times best-selling author. His website is Jihad Watch. And Robert, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. We got so many things to cover here, but I appreciate your time.
Always a pleasure, Denise. Thank you.
Let's start off with this. What is the Canary Mission?
The Canary Mission is a wonderful organization that is dedicated to exposing anti-Semitism, primarily Muslim groups on campuses. It's really astonishing because if you follow them on Twitter, you will see them giving the actual quotes with screenshots of Muslim students and even professors at times saying they want to kill all the Jews, they want to hit Jews, things like that, that just absolutely would not be tolerated from any other group. But because everybody is so deathly afraid of so-called Islamophobia, this kind of thing goes on and nobody really minds, except Canary Mission.
But it's not just domestic campuses, is it?
It's they actually also deal with white supremacists, neo-Nazis, not the ones who are people who are resisting jihad terror, who are often accused falsely of being neo-Nazis or white supremacists, but real ones who are also running around on campuses. And Canary Mission does wonderful work in keeping track and exposing both of those groups.
And when they're exposed, Robert, what really happens? Do the university administrators get involved at all, or is it just kind of we can't touch it, it's free speech?
Most of the time, it's the latter. Most of the time, they say, we can't do anything. But the main thing that's done, I think, is create awareness among people of just how extensive Islamic anti-Semitism is on campuses in the United States and elsewhere, that people don't realize how much this sort of thing goes on. And that's one of the main services that Canary Mission provides, that they show people this is not a tiny minority of extremists who are twisting and hijacking the peaceful religion of Islam. This is common, daily, and mainstream.
Robert, is this a situation that is coming out of boycott, divest, and sanction, BDS, and Free Palestine? Is that kind of driving some of these attitudes and some of these activities on campus?
Absolutely, Denise, because the state of Israel is demonized so routinely on campuses, and the most outlandish Palestinian propaganda is presented as if it were fact. And the consequence is often very dangerous for Jewish students and pro-Israel students, especially nowadays when the left on campus is becoming increasingly aggressive and emboldened and violent. There have been Jewish students who've been attacked, and others who defend Israel have been physically assaulted or shouted down, or both. And this kind of thing, this also, along with the anti-Semitism that fuels this kind of behavior, this is all far more common on campuses than most people realize.
And so then this also shuts down any kind of speech. So if there's a particular student group that would like to expose some of this or have a normal cogent debate on any of this, then that's not likely going to happen either, as we've seen with some speakers at, say, Berkeley, correct?
Yeah. The left is increasingly authoritarian, along with being increasingly violent. Not interested in discussion, not interested in debate, but only interested in shutting down its foes. This is one of the reasons why they're always calling conservatives Nazis, because, of course, nobody's in favor of Nazis. And it's a lot easier to say, we got to shut down these Nazis on campus than it is to say, we don't like these people with conservative views, and we don't want to have a fair discussion. And so they first smear and defame us in order to silence us and to aid in their effort to silence us.
When the school administrators kind of do nothing, and if in fact, I don't want to say support, but I guess approve of these kind of activities, almost every university system takes federal dollars. Would it be prudent to suspend those federal dollars until such time that these school administrators address these kinds of activities?
Oh, yeah. Denise, I'm all for that. I think it would be a very good thing to do, and I hope that someday this kind of thing is implemented, that when there's the forcible suppression of dissenting ideas on campuses, and if that happens on a frequent or habitual basis, then that campus should not receive any kind of federal funding.
What about the professors? Don't we have a
Well, this is the problem, really. The students are the ones doing it, but the professors are responsible, because these students aren't coming out of high school being hardened Marxist, Antifa activists. They are recruited and indoctrinated, brainwashed essentially by the professors, who are almost universally far to the left. Of course, one or two get in, and then they, as people retire or move on, they only hire people who see things the way they do. And so ultimately you have the situation that we have now, since that kind of thing has been going on for decades. You have only hardcore far leftist professors almost on every campus. Conservative professors, if they exist at all, where they exist at all, are harassed and ridiculed, silenced, marginalized, and so on until they're gone, and then they're replaced by still more leftists.
How come we haven't had any congressional hearings on this? I mean, we see some things, reports from Campus Reform, that are bringing some of this to some attention, Robert, but it just seems like if there was a congressional hearing, especially when it comes to the Department of Education, then I think it gets much broader discussion. But I don't see anybody in Washington, D.C. that even wants to tackle this, do you?
No, and I think it's because the universities nowadays, they have these endowments. They're really well-heeled, extraordinarily so. They have so much money, and they're able to bring politicians to heel in the same way. Lobbyists, they know where to grease palms, and they know how to do it so that it escapes detection. And so they've been able to keep everything quiet about the scandal that is our colleges and universities today.
What role is the media playing? Are they just kind of very selective, and if they report anything, you got to go find it on the internet because they're not giving it any kind of airtime?
Sure. I mean, of course, the media is the same way. And a lot of that has been the case because of the same process taking place in the media as took place in the universities, that you have leftists coming in, they only hire their peers, they only give good reviews to their peers, until finally the conservatives are all gone or are a tiny and embattled minority. And so you have that happening also in the media. So that 90% routinely we see surveys showing that 90%, 85%, 95% of the journalists, of reporters, voted Democrat, consider themselves liberals, and so on. And this is going to skew, they deny it, but this is going to skew their perspective on the news and the way they report the news. There is no way that they can remain even-handed and objective because they don't even know what that means. They don't know really what it would mean to see the issues that they're covering from the other side, from a side that they oppose. And so you only get one perspective in the establishment media. And the establishment media, because they agree with the perspective of the professors, you don't find them questioning the massive bias that's on college campuses.
Robert, we're not even seeing media reports on what's happening, for instance, in Nigeria or out of the United Nations or Burkina Faso. I mean, and almost every day at one point there was reporting on what was happening with Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq. We're not even getting that anymore. If we get anything, it's just North Korea is helping the Assad regime with chemical weapons, but that's about it. They're still not talking about the persecutions that are happening, but it's going on almost hourly someplace across the globe. We can't. How can we force this discussion, and how can we force the headlines to say, it's an ugly world out here, and these are the reasons why, and such that it can happen?
Well, the only thing we can do is keep telling the truth and keep showing up the patchy, inconsistent, and tendentious coverage of the mainstream media, and to continue. Now, this is why they're trying to cut out conservatives from the social media, and there's a concerted effort by Facebook, by Twitter, by YouTube, and so on to shut us down. They're trying to prevent this alternative perspective from being aired. And ultimately, if they succeed there, then we're just going to have to find new platforms. We cannot allow ourselves to be silenced.
What's your biggest frustration? I mean, you do a lot of traveling, you do a lot of investigation. If you were going to have an audience at the White House, what would be your presentation?
I would tell the president that he needs to follow through on his identification of radical Islamic terrorism, as he puts it, that he needs to overhaul the FBI and intelligence community's approach to the terror threat, which Obama removed all mention of Islam and jihad from counterterror training. And the president needs to understand the implications of that unless there is some agent who learns these things on his own, they're not going to understand the motivating ideology behind the terror threat. And so they're not going to really be able to understand the people that they are trying to counter. And, you cannot defeat an enemy you don't understand, but there's no way to do that. It's the fundamental adage of warfare, know your enemy. And so this has to be reversed, and there needs to be a massive overhaul of the so-called Countering Violent Extremism program, which is an Obama program that is our primary approach to the terror threat, never mentions Islam or jihad, never equips agents to deal with the terror threat, and a honest appraisal of the fact that this terrorism is by and large coming from the Islamic community, motivated by Islamic texts and teaching, so that we have to understand those texts and teachings in order to deal with it effectively.
Is it a tired subject now, Robert, that nobody really wants to breach it anymore? I mean, or talk about it? It's kind of like, okay, been there, did that, we're over it.
Sure, the lines are drawn to a tremendous degree. People think that it's a religion of peace, and that's all there is to it. Or else they think that it is the motivating factor behind jihad terrorism. And really, the lines are drawn. A lot of people ask me at times, what do you think it's going to take for there to be a general understanding of this issue? And I think, well, nothing really, because no number of jihad terror attacks in the United States is going to convince people at this point, people who are convinced that Islam is peaceful. No number of jihad terror attacks is going to convince them otherwise, because they'll just continue to think that this is that tiny minority of extremists that's causing trouble again.
We don't hear much about CARE, and we don't hear much about ISNA or Muslim Student Organization anymore, and I would argue that as long as we don't, then they're getting away with some things going on, say, in the last year that we're not necessarily aware of. Would that be an overstatement?
Indeed. Oh, there's no doubt about that. And that's part of the problem, actually, that we've been discussing, that when our intelligence and law enforcement agencies are forbidden to study Islam as an ideology that motivates jihad terror activity, then you have groups like CARE, like ISNA, like the Muslim Students Association on campuses that are not engaging in terrorism, but they are engaging in activity that is enabling terrorism. There are many, many jihad terrorists who come out of the Muslim Students Associations of various colleges and universities in the U.S., and there are many that have taught things like, you must not cooperate with law enforcement, you must not aid in counter-terror efforts, it's Islamophobic, and so on. This kind of thing enables jihad terror activity. And because there is no understanding of jihad terror activity at the highest levels, there's no understanding of that.
Right after Trump was sworn in, I was really hoping, and it's probably my naivete, that an order would come down that the Justice Department would have to release the Holy Land Foundation trial documents in full. And they haven't. And I would argue that that would change the conversation, not only nationally, but globally. And as a consequence, I believe that it would open even more investigations, because my gut tells me that there is another Holy Land Foundation operation going on as you and I speak.
Sure.
What say you?
The thing is, they have powerful friends, and the Muslim Brotherhood has many, many allies, many, many fellow travelers within the United States government, and so they have the means and the will to stymie those kinds of investigations. And this is why you haven't seen that kind of a follow-up.
We're hearing that Egypt has kind of been taking on the Muslim Brotherhood, and they've been tracking money and people and those kinds of things, in which, if all of those things are true, that's great. But I'm not convinced it is. I think what has been done so far is merely a gesture and not a very serious, this is going to go away for once and for all. You agree?
Yeah, I certainly, yes. I mean, one of the problems when you're dealing with Egypt is that they have so many Muslim Brotherhood supporters in the country that the president, al-Sisi, has to be very careful in not alienating them, because he doesn't want to be dealing with an uprising and an attempted coup and so on. So this means, in effect, that the Brotherhood and other like-minded groups have much more of a free reign in that area than we would like to see.
What's preventing this new Trump administration from declaring officially the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terror organization?
Here again, it's all the Brotherhood's friends in the United States government. You remember the Representative Michelle Bachmann. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. No, I'm saying they're still within government.
Gotcha. Yes, they're still there. And, she called for an investigation in 2012 of Muslim Brotherhood infiltration into the U.S. government, and was ridiculed and vilified as a bigot and a racist and so on. And there was never any actual investigation of that Muslim Brotherhood infiltration. So, she was called names and there was no investigation, but is there the infiltration? We still don't know.
Well, we had this kind of weird thing, the Muslim travel ban, as they called it. I never called it a ban. I only called it a suspension. And it wasn't even strictly Muslim. It was, but anyway, I think that the Trump administration made a mistake, because I think that they should have released some documents and some investigations that had been going on, least of which was the Holy Land Foundation trial first, and then it would have given a premise or a standard by which to support his executive order. Would you have agreed with that?
Yeah, sure. But you're also dealing with people that it doesn't matter what he did, they were going to oppose it. Of course, the Democratic Party opposes any restrictions on immigration because that's their voting base. They want to bring in these people who will then be beholden to them and vote Democrat.
We've heard recently from Louis Farrakhan that obviously he hates the Jews and now he's coming after the whites. And I would say that, the Nation of Islam probably has some kind of nonprofit status with the IRS. When those kinds of things happen, can they remove that nonprofit status?
Sure, theoretically. But here again, you've got to be able to have the people who have the will and the political capital to be able to pull it off.
Okay, well, you and I have just solved a whole bunch of problems. So we've addressed all kinds of things here, but we didn't get down to kind of the grassroots and local law enforcement, because I had argued that they still have the same problems today that they had during the Obama administration. So they have kind of been, that whole fusion center database kind of thing has kind of gone by the wayside too. Is there a way to resurrect any of that at the local level?
Same thing, same thing. The problem that we're facing all across the board in the United States today is that there are deeply entrenched forces that are still trying to perpetuate the Obama agenda, to sabotage the Trump agenda, and to make sure that nothing is done to drain the swamp, as is the phrase. And so the obstructions are at the local level, and they're at the state level, and they're at the national level. We all should be trying to push against them as much as we can, but these are very powerful forces.
Let's travel back a second to Israel, because I argue that I don't think Israel is... I would like to see Israel throw some big dollars at doing a marketing PR historical campaign that goes globally, if for nothing else, to help terminate UNRWA, which is the Palestinian exclusive department at the United Nations. I know the United States had earmarked, I don't know, I think it was around $40 million to counter Islamic State's message, and now they're taking that same earmark and doing it for Russia. The United States used to be very good at messaging, and I don't see any messaging happening at all coming out of the State Department, or really Israel as it should. Do you?
No, and I don't know why this is not being done. I think that part of it is that we are dealing with a jihad terror threat, and there is so much insistence that any resistance to jihad terror is racism and bigotry. And so people are afraid to explore the ideology, and there's all this dancing around it. And this is one of the reasons why the Obama administration implemented that so-called countering violent extremism program in the first place, so as to avoid mentioning Islam and supposedly offending Muslims. And so I think that's one of the reasons why that you don't have a large-scale PR effort. As you did in the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was the Voice of America, there was Radio Free Europe, and they directly confronted the communist ideology, and explained why the Western capitalist system was a better way of life. Nowadays, there is no, and there never has been, any effort to confront Sharia and the Islamic way of life and say the way of freedom and the way of the West is better. It would be Islamophobic, and so it's not done.
Ooh, Robert, you got a lot of work to do. And I'm trying to help you out here, but you got a lot of work to do. In fact, I would say we all do. But Robert, we appreciate your honesty and all the boundless energy that you're putting into this whole issue, because I'm sad to see that it's really just gone away, and I don't want it to go away. I don't think, because it hasn't been resolved. But thanks for your time, and thanks for your attention, constant attention to this, and come back soon.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.
All right, more coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with me.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you this 24/7 stream of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. We are a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. If you're able, please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. Your donation will go a long way in helping us continue to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
This is Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience. When I'm not debating with Donna Fiducia about politics, I listen to Cowboy Logic Radio. Why, you ask? Because outside of my blog, founderscode.com, and my own radio show, the Denise Simon Experience, Cowboy Logic is by far the most entertaining and informative radio show on planet Earth. Plus, Don makes me feel guilty if I don't listen to his radio show every week.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. You know, one of the little services that this radio show does is we try and follow up on things that we present to our listeners, and we're going to do that in this last segment. We had talked earlier, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, about a case out of Minnesota where you can't wear certain clothing if you're going to any kind of voting poll or anything like that, and so it ended up becoming a very weird kind of legal case. And so Win Faw, the Pacific Legal Foundation, has been very gracious to accept the invitation to join us to discuss this case because it did hit the Supreme Court last week. And so, Win, thanks so much for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We're anxious to hear about it.
Hi, Denise. Thanks for having me on.
This case goes back a couple of years, does it not? I kind of want to do a little bit of a refresher here on Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Mansky. Is that right?
Yes. This case does, in fact, go back several years. In 2010, our main client, Andy Selick, was wearing a T-shirt that said, "Don't tread on me," with a picture of the Gadsden flag and a logo of the local Tea Party, and he was twice stopped by a local poll worker and prevented from voting because he was wearing that shirt, and he was only allowed to vote on the third try after the poll worker took his name and address down for prosecution. So that's how it all began, and we've been litigating this case for over 7 years now.
Things do move slowly, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And in fact, Andy has had he's been up and down the district court and the Court of Appeals twice, and that's one of the reasons why it moved even slower than usual for a court case. And then Pacific Legal Foundation, which obviously has had a pretty good track record of success in the Supreme Court, including 9 wins in our last 10 cases. We took this case over at the cert stage and got the case granted by the Supreme Court and argued the case on Wednesday.
Don't tread on me isn't really I would say really a political statement for the shirt itself, that text. I mean, it's not taking one political stance over another. In fact, I would say it's historical. And so do we have a situation here where poll workers were trained to look out for certain things and they could discriminate on what was acceptable and what wasn't when?
Well, I think this law is so broad that poll workers could indeed discriminate on what is acceptable and what is not. I mean, as you might have seen from the oral argument transcript, Justice Alito asked the government's lawyer, well, could someone wearing a shirt with the text of the Second Amendment be prosecuted under this law? And the lawyer said yes. What about the First Amendment? The lawyer said no. So basically, you have poll workers in different areas of Minnesota not only banning shirts with the constitutional amendments on them, but also picking and choosing which constitutional amendments they would allow into the polling place. So broad laws like this definitely invite viewpoint discrimination, and that's one of the reasons why it's unconstitutional.
When is this I would have imagined, how long has this particular law been on the books in Minnesota? I mean, maybe we ought to start there. I mean,
this particular law has been on the books since the early 1900s, but in 2010, right before the lawsuit was filed, or right before the relevant lawsuit was filed, Minnesota promulgated a election day policy to clarify what political means and to enforce this law against people wearing shirts featuring the logo of the Tea Party and MoveOn.org and so on. But to be clear, it's not just people wearing T-shirts with the Tea Party's logos, First Amendment rights that we're fighting for. It's also people wearing T-shirts with the logos of the AFL-CIO and the Chamber of Commerce and countless other groups associated with a recognizable political view, which is what is prohibited in this election day policy, and which is what the government admitted could be banned at the polling place. Now, we just don't think that such a broad ban on the First Amendment freedom of expression is constitutional.
So if they were wearing a bracelet or a necklace, that pretty much said the same thing, they probably would have gotten by with this, although there's really fundamentally not any difference except perhaps in size. That would have.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I think that's a tough question, but I think those would actually be prohibited at the polling place because the text of the law says no political badges, buttons, or insignia may be worn at the polling place. So if you were wearing just a button that said, Me Too or Black Lives Matter, sure. I mean, I think that would plainly qualify under the text of the statute. So I don't think it would be any different with a necklace or a bracelet, even though, as you mentioned, the risk of that form of self-expression influencing the behavior of anyone else is very, very minuscule.
So we have this Andy character, the poor guy who was wearing this T-shirt. Is he actually seeking damages or anything like that, or he just wants the law changed or specified?
No, Andy Seelig is just wanting the law changed, and he wants the law changed not for himself, not just for himself, but also for voters across Minnesota and the 9 other states that have laws that are similar to Minnesota's, because a lot of states, a minority of states have these sort of broad laws on all political expression, and that's just not right. A ban that encompasses everything from shirts that say the Tea Party to the Chamber of Commerce, to the AFL-CIO, that's just too broad, and that's why groups from all sorts of ideological viewpoints, from the Cato Institute to the ACLU, have filed briefs in support of our clients and the First Amendment.
So if you happen to be an employee at the NRA and you show up in an NRA T-shirt because that's the quasi-uniform to vote, then you would be turned away.
Well, the policy doesn't. The policy allows people to vote in the shirts, but basically, what they would do is they would take down your name and address in this sort of election handbook and refer you to the local attorney, county attorney, for potential prosecution. And there are two forms of prosecution. One is the prosecution for petty misdemeanor, which could be fines up to $300, or there's some sort of third-party administrative proceeding in Minnesota with fines up to $5,000. So we don't really have a deep record of prosecution in Minnesota, besides, of course, what happened to our clients because of the chilling effect of this law. So if you were a member of the NRA, like you were saying earlier, and you had this shirt, you might not wear this shirt to the polling place, or you might not even vote in the first place because of this law, because you are in fear of, yes, you are subject to prosecution under the law.
How did this case ever make it out of the state and head to the Supreme Court? It's really kind of ridiculous that after all of these years that the language wasn't cleaned up 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 5 years ago. I mean, did this legislature not even bother? They just are happy with it and just let it roll?
The government does seem very happy with it. Throughout the litigation, the government has said that it seeks to create a polling place where the only form of expressive activity was voting. Now, that can't be right because, as we know, the First Amendment protects so many more forms of expression than just voting. They protect your right to express yourself through apparel. For example, high school students wearing black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. The Supreme Court has said that is protected by the First Amendment in a very important case called Tinker versus Des Moines. And here we have people who just want to express themselves, express their associations, express their viewpoints by the simple wearing of a T-shirt, and something like that shouldn't subject a voter to prosecution by the government.
When this kind of tells me that a polling place has become a constitution-free zone, and and it's a voting place. I mean, isn't there just some kind of real division there in what duty is?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that the government, what the Minnesota government at least has tried to do, is create sort of a political speech-free zone at the polling place. And our argument is that a political speech-free zone is inconsistent with the free speech clause of the First Amendment. People are allowed to express their viewpoints, although to different degrees, but they're allowed to express their viewpoints in schools just as they are on public sidewalks, and a polling place where it seems to me that is the ultimate expression of your political viewpoints shouldn't become a political speech-free zone.
There are, at quick glance, there's about 10 states out there that have almost exact same language kind of law. So based on the Supreme Court decision, I guess we'll start with Minnesota. Will it then force Minnesota to amend the law or delete the law? And what about these other states? How would it affect them as well?
Yeah, so first, with respect to Minnesota, it would invalidate the Minnesota law in its entirety. Now, what happens in practice is that a lot of the states or governments will go back to the drawing board and enact a law that's more narrowly tailored and more respectful of First Amendment rights. As far as the other states, a lot of times the other states will change their laws in response to a Supreme Court decision. But if those states don't, I think we would, try to find out more facts. And if those states hamper free speech activities, just as the Minnesota law does, then I think we would be open to looking at another lawsuit in those other states representing voters wearing the T-shirts of, say, the AFL-CIO, the Chamber of Commerce, or any one of the organizations with a recognizable political view.
Well, there's a lot of cases before the Supreme Court that are really similar cases for case law to cite here. I'm kind of surprised that the Supreme Court took this case. Are you?
I'm really not, because this is a very important case for voters everywhere. voting, the right to vote, and the right to First Amendment are both something that the Supreme Court has talked about over recent years. And we have seen a lot of news reports. For example, people who were stopped at the polls in Texas for wearing an Alaska souvenir shirt with a picture of a moose head because of a poll worker saying that shirt could be misconstrued as support for Sarah Palin. You have stories of students from the Massachusetts. Yeah, exactly, right? You have students from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who went to vote in states like Colorado and Florida, who were stopped by poll workers because they wore MIT shirts that the poll workers misconstrued as support for then candidate Mitt Romney. So it is really a national issue and an issue that's important for millions of Americans whose speech would be chilled by the effect of laws like Minnesota's. So I'm not surprised that the Supreme Court has taken this case to vindicate the constitutional rights of all of those Americans.
All right, well, I'm going to be real snotty here. It's probably a good thing I don't work at a law firm. But let's talk about the training here. I mean, what does the training look like that the State Elections Commission does for these poll workers that essentially deputizes these poll workers to be little, clothing police? I mean, one poll worker could just go, yeah, go ahead and vote, we don't care. And another one, in the next town over is not letting anybody in. You see, I mean, I could see that it would be real disjointed in some kind of enforcement. Would it be?
No, I think you're absolutely right that it would be disjointed in the enforcement because, yes, these poll workers get some limited training on what to do, but no amount of training can kind of solve the problems created by the vague and the scope of the statute. For example, a liberal poll worker might be more willing to stop someone wearing conservative apparel, say a shirt that said NRA, from going to the polling place without his name being taken down for prosecution. At the same time, a more conservative poll worker might be more apt to take down the name of someone who went to vote wearing an NAACP or ACLU T-shirt. So the problems with viewpoint discrimination, or the potential for viewpoint discrimination, is quite rampant with an overbroad statute like this. And that's one of our arguments in trying to get this court to strike down the law as unconstitutionally overbroad.
I find it really remarkable that in all this time, some other legislator or some other governor, in the state hasn't said, we got this case. It makes us look like idiots in this state. Has there been anything actually submitted that you are aware of in interrogatories or whatever when to amend the law for the legislature? I mean, has anything been introduced that
No.
says that we can't go down this road?
No, they haven't really tried to amend the law. At the Supreme Court level, the government tried to narrow the scope of the law by saying, it only bans apparel that a reasonable observer would find to be political. Well, as Justice Alito's questioning at the argument pointed out, I mean, everybody thinks that he or she is a reasonable observer, but a lot of times people will disagree about what is political and what is not political. And if you're a voter and you could be fined thousands of dollars for wearing something that is construed as political to the polling place, I think the chilling effects are so real that you won't risk prosecution by voting while wearing your favorite T-shirt, whether that said something like the ACLU, the NRA, Chamber of Commerce, or AFL-CIO. I think a lot of people would be chilled into self-censorship based on an overbroad law like this.
We've got so much self-censorship going on anyway. Now, this whole procedure here, I'm a little curious in this procedure. I'm not even sure that it makes sense to me that a poll worker can take down, I guess the person's information by looking at their driver's license and saying, this is your name and this is your address. We're going to write this down and we hand this over, to the district attorney or the prosecutor or what? Like,
Yeah,
wham, a tattletale.
Yeah, they hand it over to, I believe it's a county attorney who then makes the ultimate decision about whether or not to prosecute the voter. Now, to be fair, there haven't been too many prosecutions, but I think that raises two additional problems. First, it doesn't do anything to solve the problem of the chilling effect of the law.
Right.
People who know about this law won't wear those T-shirts to the polling place, and that's the exact result that the government wants. And two, I think it suggests that the state's interest in enforcing this law is actually quite low, because they argue that the state somehow has that this law somehow prevents voter intimidation, even though Minnesota, like every other state in the whole entire country, already has existing laws dealing specifically with voter intimidation. It just suggests that such a broad ban on apparel isn't something that the state is really interested in, and besides the chilling effect this has on voters, it doesn't really serve any real state interest. And if you pass a law that doesn't serve any real state interest, that law is unconstitutional under the First Amendment.
Yeah, what's the point? So then this county attorney, what does he do? He calls up, Andy, goes, "Hey, dude, we're sending the police over because, you're essentially arrested for violating law 1, 2, 3, 4, right?"
Right. So the county attorney didn't do that in this case. Andy filed his First Amendment lawsuit pretty much right after his name and address was taken down for prosecution, it made headlines, and that might be one of the reasons why the government didn't go after him. But, I think to put Andy's story in perspective, even though the Election Day policy says you're supposed to be allowed to vote, the poll worker in this case took hours to let Andy, to vote. And, Andy is such a strong-willed person that he stood in the cold Minnesota winter for hours before going back to the polling place and casting his vote. But I don't think it would surprise anybody if there were other voters in Minnesota who, while confronted with the exact same situation, would just say, "Forget it. I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to exercise my right to free speech. I'm just going to let the law kind of hamper my right to vote and my right to free speech."
And censorship.
Exactly.
So now let's go over to the Supreme Court here. When this is being argued before the justices, did any justices come out with a statement and or question that really had you or others that were representing the case scratching their heads?
Well, I think one justice asked, this is a polling place, why should there be any First Amendment rights at all? And, I was a little bit put off. I was a little bit confused about the question. I think the justice might have been suggesting something else. But, of course, there's First Amendment rights everywhere, especially in a place like a polling place. I mean, if you imagine a law, I know this is just for one day out of possibly 1 or 2 days out of the year, but if you think of a time to express your political opinions, what better time to express your political opinions than on Election Day? I mean, everybody else is doing it. And so this law is like a law that says that bans saying Merry Christmas on December 25th. I mean, it might be just one day, but it's a very, very important day for saying those words and for expressing your political beliefs.
There's also a very similar case that the Supreme Court took up, and I don't know whether you hung around for this one or not, but it was about the mandatory union dues, and that these people that have certain employment are forced into a union, pay the dues, and then they don't have any say-so about where those union dues go. Did you by chance happen to hang around for that one?
Yeah, that case was actually argued 2 days earlier, and at the Supreme Court. I waited in line, starting at 6 in the morning in the lawyer's line, which is good enough for most arguments, but that was such a big case that it wasn't good enough to get into that argument. I did, however, stay around in what's called the lawyer's lounge with a bunch of other members of the Supreme Court bar, and we listened live to the oral arguments in that case. And I think the court is certainly willing to hold that law unconstitutional, and for good reason, because anything that a union does, from lobbying the government for more vacation days for the workers, or higher wages, I think all of those are thought of as political. And when someone else does the lobbying, everybody else calls it political activity. So why should it be any different because it's the union doing the lobbying? I think the Supreme Court will invalidate these sort of fair share fees, which force people who don't agree with the union positions to contribute money to those positions anyway.
So that I was actually floating around on C-SPAN and saw where they were, piping in the audio from that argument on the union mandatory dues thing. I listened to it for about 10 minutes and I thought, oh God, I don't know how you guys do that. But so in your lawyer's lounge, it was pretty much the quorum that Andy in his "Don't Tread on Me" T-shirt case is going to prevail and come out a winner. And the same thing with the union dues. Is that right?
Well, we didn't really talk about the cases. We're pretty intent on kind of listening to the argument. But I do think that the union dues, the fair share provisions, will be held as unconstitutional under the First Amendment. And I think the Minnesota law, which prevented Andy Seelig from exercising his First Amendment rights, will also be held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So I think there will be at least two big Supreme Court victories, First Amendment victories from the arguments last week.
How many lawyers were in this lawyer's lounge that didn't actually get into the courtroom?
It was packed full. I would say about maybe 60 or 70 lawyers in this lawyer's lounge, which I think it usually only accommodates around 50, but it was standing room only. People were standing along the walls. It was a packed atmosphere, and it signals the interest that not just the court has, but also the Supreme Court lawyers have in First Amendment cases at the Supreme Court.
See, we don't get to know all those things. So, what you shared with us today, Wynn, has been remarkable. I'm very, very happy that you could be here on the Denise Simon Experience and kind of tell us all of these kinds of things. We don't get those kind of reports. I mean, you have to almost have a visual here, and we don't get to hear what the questions were by the panel of judges and all those kinds of things. So thank you for this. I mean, we like that detail. By the way, how many people can get into the courtroom?
Into the courtroom, I think it's also about 150 from the lawyers from the Supreme Court bar, and then 50 from the general audience.
Interesting. So, and then those that couldn't, I guess, listen to it on C-SPAN. Well, congratulations, and thank you so much for your time on this. The decision comes back, you think, when?
I predict sometime in early June, and thank you for having me on. And your listeners can check out more about Pacific Legal Foundation on our website at pacificlegal.org.
Great work, and thank you so much. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.